Yeah, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this side event on accelerating the adoption of clean vehicles. And the format of today's side event will be in a discussion format. So we have 4 excellent speakers here who will give short introductions about how their companies and initiatives are going to accelerate clean transport. And then we open the floor to audience for your questions. I would like to ask, give you the chance to ask questions from our panelists. So, just a short introduction from me. As you know, in Europe, more or less 25% of CO2 emissions comes from transport. And this number is started to decline now, slowly. But if you look at other industries, and we compare this number with 1990, it's still like higher, and we're not below 1990 level. So there's this clear need that we need to do something about. We need to move cleaner transport and low carbon transport. And moving to low carbon transport also helps us to have cleaner cities in terms of air pollution. But it's challenging, it has been challenging area to decarbonize because of the number of companies, number of car owners, and number of factors in this this area, this sector. And yeah, so I would like to ask, I would also like, as you might know that I'm from Estonia, and would like to tell you a little bit what we have done already, just, I'll be the first speaker in this case. Estonia has got the first network of fast chargers for electric cars that covers the entire country. We have 176 charging stations, and you might say the number is very small, but Estonia is a very small country. And we also have rental system for electric cars. So if you come and visit us, then you can rent an electric car and drive around. And you can go visit even islands, because even our islands, the largest islands, have charging points for electric cars. And our local governments, our social workers, are also driving around with electric cars. So you might wonder that, I said it's very challenging, to move to low carbon vehicles, and why Estonia is how did we do it? So, and where did the money come from? And the money to buy the cars and set up their charging network came from our emissions unit. Kyoto emissions units. And it wasn't just the government initiative. Government worked very closely with private companies, car companies. Mitsubishi was a major player setting up this network. And so this is something we think we need. We need sort of cooperation between the government, companies, and local government, cities. So all actors should be involved. And now you might ask a question, well, where are you getting your electricity from? So I'm sort of bits like saying, our electricity is still fossil fuel based. And you may say that, but in this case it doesn't make much difference. You get your cities cleaner because there's less air pollution, but you're just shifting the pollution from car exhaust pipes to power stations. But our cars, electric cars, have to drive on clean energy. And Estonia has quite a fast-growing renewable energy sector. We have the wind energy now, and we also we have increasing number of wind parks, wind turbines, and the electric cars using the energy from these sources. So that's for introduction, and just showing that it is a challenge, but if there's a will, there's a way, and if all actors want to work together seriously on something, it is achievable. So with that introduction, I would I forgot to also mention there's also a subsidy scheme if you want to buy an electric car in Estonia that brings in the consumers as well. With that, I would like to give the floor to our speakers, and they're going to tell us about what their companies or initiatives are doing to accelerate low carbon transport. And the first person I would like to ask to speak is perhaps we're starting for you, Pierpaolo. Okay. And Pierpaolo is from Cazzola, is from International Energy Agency from Paris. And he coordinates the work of the transport unit of the IEA Energy Technology Policy Division in the Directorate of Sustainability, Technology and Outlooks, including the development of the IEA mobility model. The floor is yours. So let's do your 5 minutes. Just.
That's okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here to speak actually not really about the modeling work or the analytical work, but more the advocacy work that we've been doing on electric mobility. The IEA is the coordinator of something called Electric Vehicle Initiative, which has been created around 2010 under the Clean Energy Ministerial. And consists basically in a network of, in a platform that enables governments which are committed to the deployment of electric vehicles to talk to each other and learn from each other on which kind of policies have been successful and which kind of policies can be replicated and why they've been successful, what has not been successful, and what should be then changed. The way this initiative works is that we have 2 meetings per year where we allow the different representatives of each of these governments to talk to each other. We have a flagship publication that has been published since 2013. It's called the Global EV Outlook. I believe if you came across, if you've been looking at a little bit of the status of the global status of electric mobility, you probably came across that. This is an opportunity essentially for us to monitor what is happening and highlight the key developments and the key points. And this is something that helps governments to learn what others have been doing and what has been actually effective. One important development that happened last year under EVI is the EV 30 at 30 campaign. This is something that was launched at the Clean Energy Ministerial in June this year. And that redefines the ambition of EVI. Initially, EVI was aiming at deploying 20 million electric vehicles by 2020, and with this campaign, we moved forward let's say, the aspirational goal of EVI. We're talking about a 30% market share for electric vehicles, including all modes except for two-wheelers, where we expect higher market shares, by 2030. And the campaign has been successful. It was launched by the Minister Wang Gang in Beijing at the last Clean Energy Ministerial. It includes a number of implementing actions which are extremely important. One of them is regarding cities, and it's one area of activity where we have been particularly active lately. We would like to, with that, to establish a similar network to what EVI represents to government by looking at local governments, so at cities. We clearly understand that the priority in terms of the policy priority to deploy successfully electric mobility has to happen in parallel at the national level, but also at the local level. And so we think that it is going to be helpful to enable cities and people working on the deployment of electric mobility in cities to learn, to have like an instrument enabling this mutual learning. So this initiative on cities is not yet launched. One of the key reasons why I actually wanted to be here today was to let people know that we are working on this and begin to spread the word and understand if there's a response, there's potential interest from people. And so if in case people want to learn more, I would be happy to follow up after this panel interview, this panel here. In terms of priorities, I think we'll have a chance to discuss the key items on the policy side that are necessary for the deployment of electric mobility. I briefly mentioned the idea of looking at national and local policies. One other element that I think is worth being mentioned just as an introductory talk, and then I don't want to take more time with this, is there's a necessity to look at different aspects, not just on the policy side, but also in terms of scope. Certainly, certain policies have to target vehicles. There are other policies that need to be more closely looking at chargers and the way to deploy chargers. And then there's a third element, which I think is very important for for the deployment of electric mobility, which is the integration of electric vehicles with the grid. There's a lot of scope for working on all these topics, and so all this is essentially representing the content of the initiatives we are working on. So I believe this is relevant to help boost the uptake of electric vehicles in the next few years.
Thank you, Pierpaolo. With that, we'd like to move our next speaker, and perhaps will you, Sandra, could be the next one. And our next speaker is Sandra Rolling from the Climate Group. And Sandra is leading the development of the Climate Group's new corporate leadership initiative on electromobility, EV 100, to bring together major global companies to make public commitments to electric vehicles uptake across the influence areas. Sandra.
Thanks a lot, Anela. So thanks a lot for having me here. My name is Sandra Rolling. I'm from the Climate Group. And as Anela just said, I lead the EV 100 initiative. It's really a nice complement to what Pierpaolo was just talking about, because this is about the role that companies can play in helping to roll out electromobility, and in particular from the demand side. So we know that the automotive sector needs to develop the technologies, the utilities, the charging infrastructure, but we believe that there's a big role to be played also for companies who can drive the market through their own demand for vehicles and also as an interface with staff and customers. So we're building a network of companies that are committed to electromobility, and we have invited them to make a public commitment to transition their fleets and or to roll out charging infrastructure for their staff and their customers by 2030. So it's deliberately quite an ambitious target, but the idea is really to build that first group of front runners who can say, we believe in electromobility, we believe it's ready now, and we're going to do our bit to really bring it into the mainstream. And I think if you look at sort of car registrations in a country like the UK, it's over half of the vehicles are registered to companies. So there's a large market signal right there. And also if you think about staff and customers, people who want to make individual decisions to drive an electric vehicle, then obviously having workplace charging, having charging at supermarkets and other places makes it easier for them, and it also helps to make electric vehicles much more visible in the day-to-day. If your delivery, say your postal service is coming in an electric vehicle, if your supermarket has charging, etc. We've launched 2 months ago at Climate Week in New York, initially with 10 big international companies from North America, from Europe, and also from China. We're very excited about that. And yesterday we were able to announce the latest 4 joiners. So we have 2 from New Zealand now, Mercury and Air New Zealand. We also have our first joiner from Japan, Ion Mol, and we have also Royal Haskoning, which is one of the Dutch leaders. That was the first company, I believe, to make a commitment to fully transition their leased fleets as well. And what we really want to do is connect all these different bits of leadership that we're already seeing, make it much more visible, bring that aspect into the debate, and really build a platform for companies to be part of conversations such as here today as well, to be a partner in rolling out electromobility. We're also a supporter of the EV30 at 30 initiative, so already with the idea of governments are looking at their own fleets, governments are looking at investments in charging infrastructure, companies are doing the same, so there seems to be a natural opportunity to do that in dialogue and work together as well.
Thank you, Sandra. And our next panelist to introduce their work on clean transport is Jonas Strömberg.
Yes.
Am I right?
Almost.
Almost, okay. So he's a Director of Sustainable Solutions at Scania in Sweden. And he is responsible for coordinating Scania's activities on sustainable transportation for buses and trucks. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and thank you for having us here. I represent, and maybe it's worth a comment also, that I will represent obviously the heavy duty, the buses and the trucks, and they are not cars, and there is actually a difference when we try to make low carbon solutions here. I will tell you a little bit about the possibilities and the barriers and some of the activities we see when it comes to making heavy-duty transport more low carbon. To set the scene a little bit, heavy-duty transport is many things. It's all about city buses in city centers, to suburban, to regional transport, but also to the really long distance, long haulage and operation. And for all these different transport missions, we will need different solutions. There will not be one silver bullet technology here, and I think that is quite important to remember. And I think the really good news is that I would say for the last decade or so, our company have provided low carbon buses and trucks that we sell for the same price as a diesel vehicle. So my really strongest signal here is that technology is not the problem. These products are available. Typically we would have products for operating on biogas, on ethanol, biodiesel, synthetic diesel, and all of these solutions are also hybridized. We are also working, and these solutions are available today, I really would like to say that, and they could be purchased for the same price as a diesel vehicle. Then we're working really hard on the electric side to try and electrify, but it is not as easy to electrify a heavy-duty vehicle as it is a car. Heavy-duty vehicles operate for over 20 hours a day with really, really heavy transport missions. But we are getting there as well. Typically city centers and some dedicated lanes are the areas we see that we could electrify. But if we look in a medium-term perspective, it's not realistic to think that we could electrify away more than maybe 10% of the diesel used in the transport system for heavy duty today, and we really need to do better than that more quickly. So we need cost-efficient solutions that we could deploy here and now. And that brings me maybe to the first barrier I see, and that is really that we tend to have a very strong focus on silver bullet solutions today, and we particularly want all of the transport sector to be electrified, which is really not realistic for heavy duty. And then we tend to forget a little bit about the cost-efficient solutions that already exist and that could bring down CO2 from heavy duty with over 90%, typically the solutions I just mentioned. So really sometimes perfect is the enemy of good here, and we see a strong will from decision makers to have everything perfect from day one. So I really think we should spend much more of the effort to deploying the existing green solutions that we could do. The second barrier, which I also think is maybe the greatest opportunity for transport, for heavy-duty transport, is that we don't use public procurement of transport in the way that we really could. If public procurement of transport would focus more on CO2 incentives in a functional way, not looking so much on technology, but really putting functional CO2 demands and maybe really measuring the tender efficiency if it is for how much CO2 cuts you would get for every euro you spend. And if you could also include in your tenders a much broader view of the whole transport system, including city, suburban and long distance transport in your whole region, looking at all types of vehicles and all types of energy and fuel forms and infrastructure for that in the tender. So really tendering for a whole package. Then the industry and partners in the industry could really come up with cost-efficient, low-carbon solutions. And this has been proven a couple of times when this has been done. So we could really use public procurement in a much more efficient way. And it really works. I would just like to give the example of Stockholm, where this type of functional procurement with the demand for CO2 without looking at technology has been in place for 15 years. That has led to the result that all buses, all 2,300 buses in the region of Stockholm, operate on fossil-free fuels. We have got the ideal solutions for the city centers, where we have the electrified hybrids on biofuels, and we have the biogas and the liquid biofuels for the longer type of transport. This has then spread to all the other cities in the country, so now 73% of all procured public transport in Sweden operates on biofuels, renewable fuels, and that has also then created an infrastructure for these fuels throughout the country. So that was an extremely strong tool for making this happen. And when we have the infrastructure, then the private truck operators can also start using it. So that has been a very good way of using the public procurement tool, I would say. We work in Scania in two initiatives. We work in a number of initiatives, but I would like to mention two. We work within UITP in order to create good advisory documents for how to procure clean transport systems. We have a group within within UITP. And we're also a member of a very newly founded initiative by the C40, the UN, and the ICCT, which is the Soot Free Bus Partnership, where we aim to provide really cost-efficient, clean buses to the 20 most polluted cities in the world, which is a great initiative. So we really hope for that. And again, it is also important that these cities can use procurement in an open way. So I would like to end it with that, but I really want to stress that technology is not the problem. If you want low-carbon public transport, the technology is available.
Thank you, Jonas. It's interesting to hear that Scania is working on heavy transport and trucks. It's the electric trucks.
Yeah, we also work on the electric trucks and the electric buses. We are putting out our first tests here, but obviously it is tougher to make this commercial. I see the first commercial operations will probably be in city center transport, where you have buses that dedicatedly works on one line, that you really don't need the flexibility in the vehicle. A truck very often needs to be flexible. It needs to go on many routes, and therefore it's really hard to lock it to an infrastructure in this way. But there are definitely good segments where we could electrify, but realistically maybe not more than 10% until 2030. So that's why we need also the other solutions, because we have a lot of CO2 emissions from transport.
Yeah, the people in the audience, if you have moved between the two zones, you can see that the electric cars are moving between the two zones, and they actually look very good, I think. It's not just like they're quiet and zero emission, but they also look good, I think. So I think the private vehicles are way ahead of heavy transport in terms of...
As I said, in electrification, I mean, a car operates maybe 2-3 hours a day in light conditions, and a heavy-duty vehicle runs for maybe 24 hours with 60 tons. It is very different.
And with that, we're moving to our last speaker, last but not least. And our last speaker is Frank Muehlon, and he's the head of ABB Global Business... ABB's global business for electric vehicle charging infrastructure. So, the floor is yours.
Okay. So, first of all, ABB, what do we have to do with that? I think it's important to understand that we look for energy, and energy coming to any point of distribution, any point of use. And one very important point of use, of course, is electrification of vehicles. So talking about this and about electric vehicle charging infrastructure, what it essentially is, it's always this discussion, chicken and egg, or Adam and Eve, what is first? And I think here now, I'm not saying we're Adam or Eve or chicken or egg, but it's an evolutionary thing. And we are part of this evolution. We are actually pioneering in this evolution, and we were just hearing you mentioned Estonia as one of the first countries. Actually, the whole network in Estonia was actually is ABB. So that's a nice link, and like this we put together also other networks. The first networks in Europe, which were beside Estonia, were Netherlands, were Denmark, Norway. So outside Europe, California. So and spreading from there. This is networks where actually ABB was on the forefront of establishing those networks. So I think we have a good base out there in a very still tiny market. But this base is now talking about DC fast chargers, and that's what it is effectively, such a network. We have 6,000 DC fast chargers around the globe out there installed, which is quite a lot. Now, looking a bit into, Jonas talked about the heavy vehicle segment. Let's maybe look a bit into the car segment as well. So if we look into the cars and see what is barriers, why is it not moving? So what we see is, of course, you need the right and proper cars. So maybe you find these cars fancy. You just drove some of them, might be, but is still not enough. So the choice you have to make if you want to drive electric is still a very limited choice. So we have to rely on the OEMs to really come up with a whole bunch of flowers of new cars, and this is luckily what is happening now. So now is the point in time where this is happening. So this will drive demand. The other thing is then the range anxiety, and there you need the chargers. Yeah. So and this is especially on the car side very important. And here a lot of initiatives are going on. It's funded by partially by private-owned or companies, partially running on venture capital, for example, or really companies who already make money with selling energy, providing that, being in the right spot, and this is good that we see those moves. So these chargers out there now, you have two types. You have AC and DC, as you know. I do not want to dive into the technology here, but we believe everything in public should have that DC is much more economic in the long run. And right now we have on the car side is like a 50 kilowatt chargers you have out there as a standard. To put that in perspective, 50 kilowatt charger take cars out there like whatever, a Nissan Leaf, a BMW i3. So those cars, you recharge your battery for another 200 kilometer of mileage in roughly 25 to 30 minutes. So that's good for now. But that's maybe not what you need if you want to drive longer distances. So the automotive OEMs are working heavily now on putting larger batteries inside the car, which is also the right thing to do with battery costs decreasing. And seeing this, of course, you want to recharge also the larger batteries in a even quicker speed. So we developed now a charging system up to 350 kilowatt for cars. This is actually something which is new in the industry, which will just launch now end of this year, early next year, with a couple of customers. And so here in that case now, the chargers are again out there in the field before the right cars are out in the field, because so far the cars cannot charge at that speed. But there are cars in the pipeline hopefully to come. So much is on the car side, and with that, and of course with the quantity of chargers out there, hopefully we'll overcome the range anxiety. And also very important is in that field is the standardization on which standards do we run. So ABB is very committed to basically follow the standards. So we follow standards, we follow open protocols. We don't want to be proprietary in there, really to help to bring the industry forward. Now, looking a bit at the bus side, if you look at that, what we see there is actually not so many standards out there now. There's a lot of regions, especially like if you go China, if you go India, wherever in those countries, they don't really follow the standards properly, but I'm very happy that also there on the bus side now, more and more OEMs, like you do as well, Jonas, and Scania, follow standards like CCS or opportunity charging, which others also do. And by doing that, we will also see more and more players in the same field, which then overcome the next barrier. Because if you're a municipality or a bus operator, usually you have no idea of what is behind. You want to have it electric, yes, of course, we immediately agree on this for inner city, but then everyone has a big question mark. And in order to be sure you invest in a future-proof technology, it's always helpful to rely on standards. And this is what we are now working on, and to also come to those standards. So much for me right now.
Thank you. Thank you to all our panelists for these excellent introductions to their work on clean mobility. So I would like to pose a question to all of you. So how important are national policies in enabling movement to acceleration of clean transport? So who would like to? And it's both, I'm thinking of both, like private transport and public transport here.
I'm happy to start, if it's on. Yeah, I'm happy to start. I believe national policies are really important. In many cases, we've actually seen cities move ahead, because I mean, very often the green transport pressure is on cities. They want to clean up and they want to do low carbon. So very often cities have done the first projects, and that has then turned into national standards in the end. For what I can say from Scandinavia is obviously that the CO2 taxation that we have on fuels, we have divided, so there's a tax on energy content and a tax on CO2 on all types of energy, not only on fuels, but on all types of energy, and that has really been a driving force for shifting all types of, not only in transport, but all types of energy. We were actually the most oil-dependent European country in 1970, and after the CO2 tax was introduced, there is no fossil energy in the system, basically, and we are on 28% biofuels in the fuel
Thank
system.
you.
Yeah.
If I may ask, what's the tax level in Sweden, CO tax?
The tax level, it varies a little bit. I mean, so there is actually the same tax level for energy content, and then you have a higher CO2 tax depending on how much CO2 there is in your. So it goes with the CO2 content basically for all the energy forms.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that?
Happy to.
Yep.
I think there's a fundamental complementarity between national and local policies. The national policies at this stage are very important to bring the costs down for electric vehicles, while the local policies are more interesting to bring the consumer interest up. For instance, if you think about a city that is announcing bans on diesels, I live in one of those cities, because I live in Paris, and you do see that there is already a decline in residual values for internal combustion engine. So people owning internal combustion engine cars basically see directly in their pocket the fact that their own vehicles are losing value. And this is an element, for instance, which is inducing demand and interest in looking at new solutions. If at the same time you have a national policy that reduces the cost, for instance, like differentiated taxation, this is again something that happens in France, where you make the polluting vehicles pay for the increased technological cost of the less polluting vehicles, then you end up in a situation where you may begin to have a significant dynamic in market uptake. And I totally agree that there are other elements like the availability of models that also play out, but I think the role of national policy at this stage is extremely important for that. In perspective, it's not just national policy, but there are also cross-national policies. It's very recent news about the announcement of the proposal of the European Commission on fuel economy standards. So that's another place where I think, I would qualify that in the national policy category, essentially, not in local policy. That is also extremely relevant to mobilize investments in the private sector, and namely in OEMs, because they clearly see the fact that that's where the regulatory framework is going. Inevitably, in the framework of a few years, you cannot reach certain limits without having invested on electrification. So that, as again, is a national instrument that is extremely important for a certain part of the response from the private sector and from the system in general.
Yeah, I would underline especially that forward-looking perspective element of it, I think. So, you know, to the point that I think Frank was making earlier as well, we're also hearing a lot from companies that say, you know, we want the electric vehicles, we believe it's a really better solution in the long term, but we don't have all the options yet. We also don't have the volumes yet. We don't get them as easily in all markets. And I think it's partly about the expectation of all stakeholders for where it's going to be. So if you have countries like the UK or France saying we're going to phase out diesel, if, you know, even in a country like India that have set themselves a very ambitious target of going electric by 2030, you can really see how that has changed a lot in terms of the conversations and the investments that are happening, sort of various stakeholders coming together around sort of a joint time horizon, if you will. So I think that's really important, in addition to all the practical elements, obviously, in terms of subsidies and other types of support.
So from my end, actually, I think everything has been said. I also believe a lot of, let's say, local policies are in place. A lot also national policies are partially in place. But essentially, if you want to have a high adoption rate, what you need is the consumers really driving it. There's no stronger force than the consumers demanding it. Yeah? So if you say no, I do not get on this dirty vehicle anymore. I want to have something different. I want to have a different driving behavior. And actually, it's the same cost. It's not 30% more. It's the same cost, and it's a nice-looking car. I don't have range anxiety, so then I buy it. Or I want to get in the city. Why do I get on this? Why do I drive with my bicycle behind that bus? That's not nice. I want to have a different one in the city. Yeah? So if consumers really drive it, that is a much stronger force than if we just put policies. But we need the policies to ignite it, yeah? So, and to help in the beginning. So.
Thank you. So we do need policy and policies, national policies, a driver behind moving forward with clean transport, and also helping consumers to understand the need of doing it, and also, like, if we talk about taxation, then also, like, make the consumer sort of well educated consumer choice and choose cleaner transport. That I would like to ask, like, my panelists also, like, you know, we're talking about the UK here with Estonia, you mentioned Netherlands, but if you think of developing countries, so what needs to be done? How we could just, like, get the scale up efforts also in developing countries, and what your thoughts on that? What needs to be done for that? Really?
Mm-hmm. So that's a very maybe let me start now. It's a very interesting pitch, because if you look to developing countries, very often you think, can they afford that? Are they ready for it? If you look at the type of EVs you have out there right now. On the other hand, if you look, if you're in Delhi city or wherever, this is the places where it's most needed. Yeah? So you have that spread. But so what can be done? I think it starts actually from a mobility which is not necessarily on four wheels. Yeah? So we have topics like we just had a nice project in India with rickshaws. Yeah? So it's a bit wider. So basically, it's rickshaws charged from solar panels. And now it's in the city of Jalalapur, it's like 10,000 rickshaws now exchanged from petrol to electrical, and they're completely run on solar, which is a great exercise. Yeah? So this is affordable and it works. So if you look to developing countries, and it's also kind of an own grid where within this is working, because sometimes it's the stability of the grid there, or the energy you get. So this is because if you just would take the cars you have right now in developed countries like China for me is a developed country, and put that into a non-developed environment, it won't work. It's not affordable yet. So, and this to make that happen, you need to think a bit differently. Yeah.
That's very interesting. How did the rickshaw project come up? What was behind that?
Sorry?
Rickshaw project you did, like the rickshaws running.
The rickshaws,
Cazzola?
yeah.
How did this started, or what was behind it, really?
It was discussions with the municipality there, and so were people behind driving it and having the idea. And let's say it's at the end, it's all partnerships. It's partnership of some municipality. It's partnership of a company investing.
That sounds like quite impressive. Any other thoughts on that? On scaling up clean mobility in developing countries?
I completely agree about the fact that there's big opportunities in two-wheelers. This is, if you want, how China started to deploy electric vehicles. There's now millions of two-wheelers, hundreds of millions of two-wheelers in China. And clearly China is at the forefront, not just on two-wheelers today. There's also another element which I think is extremely relevant, and it's the need to build capacity amongst policymakers. I think some of the complexities of the policy mechanisms that are needed to boost, to stimulate electric mobility are not easy to understand and to pick up for policymakers that are not, do not have access to the capacity that exists in the developed world. So I think there must be a system enabling policymakers in developing countries to easily grasp and pick solutions, policy solutions that can then be adjusted to their own needs, specific needs. I'm thinking, for instance, nothing else than a differentiated taxation system requires a whole process that needs benchmarking. You need to understand what is the kind of market, what are the kind of characteristics of the vehicles. So if you apply a tax of X on a given vehicle emitting Y, which kind of tax rebates you could apply on a vehicle that is clean or has zero emissions, without hampering what are your average governmental revenues, for instance, from taxation of cars. So there's a number of mechanisms. There's also a process that is important, so consulting stakeholders, making sure that there's a buy-in of the different players. Industry has to be looped in that process. And this is not easy for countries that are not necessarily, I'm not thinking necessarily about the big developing countries, but smaller developing countries need to be supported in that process, in my opinion. So this element of building capacity has to be taken into account once you look at developing economies.
Thank you.
I think I could make one comment again. Big difference here between cars and heavy duty. Obviously, buses and trucks is something you buy to make money. If it costs you more than 1 cent to operate them, then it would do a diesel operation. You wouldn't buy it. So I think that is really the perspective for heavy duty. So that's why, I mean, it's fundamental in developing part of the world where we see the rapid growth, obviously, of the cities as well, to have really cost-efficient solutions that would be so cost-efficient that they could actually outcompete diesel. Otherwise, nothing will happen. That is very clear, and that's why we try to do it particularly. And in this case, I think it's a shame to ban the diesel engine, because we are using the diesel engine. If I take the example of India, where we operate in the city of Naipur together, we use a diesel-type engine to put in ethanol that operates on a level that is even 10 times cleaner than Euro 6. And we use locally produced fuel, and we do locally produced fuel from waste to power this. And by using the waste, we can actually get quite a cheap fuel resource. And then we can actually compete with diesel on a cost per kilometer basis. So that is how we operate these type of projects. And we got the question in the previous session on waste to fuel, and I think that is really a key. If you look at a country like India, you have an enormous amount of organic waste that is put into landfill. I think one of the best policies we could have is to ban putting organic into landfill. We should rather turn that into energy, into fuels, because that is a great resource that can be used. And if we use that resource, we can actually operate cheaper than diesel.
Sounds very interesting.
So I think
add anything?
Yeah, I think maybe one thought to add is also the, since we're talking about different contexts and, maybe the two-wheelers being the first thing in India, etc. I think it's also a bigger question about the technologies be part of a bigger ecosystem. So I think we work on electromobility, but already a lot of the conversations that we're having with companies is also about, we also want to get our staff actually out of cars and into public transport, and how do we integrate that? And then you have a remaining segment for cars that you want to electrify, and I think that's really useful, and maybe also an opportunity, especially for emerging economies. And if we look at India, air pollution is an issue, climate is an issue, but overall congestion obviously also a big issue there. And I think some of the companies we're talking to already have quite interesting models where it's not about company cars, but it's about providing shuttle buses and things like that, and just slightly different ways in which transport is organized. And I think it's quite useful to keep taking that on board and maybe actually learning some from that and developing that, and not necessarily just expecting the model that in some ways maybe has gone wrong for us as well to be implemented there, and just look at the technologies per se.
Thank you. So you have heard the plans of these companies, initiatives who are here today, how they think clean transport could be accelerated, and I would like to open the floor to the audience, and I'd like to ask you, so do you think they're doing enough to accelerate clean transport? And of course, you reflect, and you're welcome to ask questions from our panelists as well. Yeah.
Use the microphone. Hi, my name is Tracy Racek. Thanks so much for the great panel. Many of you are so encouraging about the transition for electric mobility, especially regarding passenger vehicles, that I'm hopeful there will be a glut of internal combustion engines 5-10 years down the road. So are there any, and could there be business models to help encourage the recycling or the next use of these old cars that are going to need to be replaced? I actually posited that to Tesla a couple years ago, and they're like, huh. But really, what are we going to do with all of these old cars? There are people who currently say, I'd love to buy an electric vehicle, but this one has 4 more years in it. And so they're waiting. People who can afford them, people who'd love to invest in electric vehicles. So is there some sort of, not just a subsidy program, but something else more creative that could be done with all these old cars that we're not quite thinking of yet?
Thank you. I think it's a very, very good question. Who would like to?
Maybe some ideas. Of course, your question kind of suggests that there is a swap immediately from EV from ICE combustion engine to EV. I mean, we would all be very glad if that would be that fast. I mean, if we look into prognosis and into various consulting groups, and I think I get a new statistics every week, which is a bit different. So they all see a tremendous growth. But I think the most bullish I saw was like 50% in EV adoption rate in passenger cars in 2050, about 50%. So this is the most bullish I saw. So now if you look into an average lifespan of a car, depending on which one you buy, but between 10 and 15 years. So I would not worry what to do with those cars, because we can still run them quite a while. And also it's not, I mean, the EV is only as good as the energy produced. So just to convert in a country where we still run on brown coal or whatever, and to put an EV, I mean, you rather lose than gain. Then better drive a diesel, much better. Yeah. So I'm not voting for this, but you have to just to be realistic. So it's overall what we see is a transition into EV, and I'm really happy that this is accelerating. But I would not have a worry on the existing fleet right now. At least not too much. Huh? Yeah.
Would anyone else like to add to that? Any other thoughts?
I'm not sure I get exactly the key point, because my understanding is that there are end-of-life regulations that basically enable you to recycle the materials already. I agree that the transition won't happen overnight. I also think there are social implications if you just transition from ICEs to batteries. So in practice, I think this will also involve internal combustion engine coexisting with batteries and being used mostly in electric mode in urban environments. But that doesn't mean that you essentially scrap entirely from today to tomorrow the technology you already have. So I'm not sure. I mean, I don't personally see that as like super urgent priority. There's other material-related challenges that I personally see as something that are probably worth being looked at, which is more related with the kind of primary materials needed to build all those batteries that you eventually would need if you have this type of increase in demand. And what are the implications on mining and the environmental consequences? I think that's a more urgent theme to look at rather than the second life of existing cars. There's also an element of declining mileage. So the older your car is, the less you drive it. So essentially, I think focusing on the renewal and making sure that that doesn't happen wrong, in my opinion, is so that is properly handled. I think it's, I don't know, I find it more. Okay.
Thank you. Okay, there's next item about to start, and we have a couple of more questions. Let's take these. There was a lady over there.
This is a question from the developing world, and particularly for Jonas. I wanted to check if you, when you were referring to heavy-duty vehicles that you could manufacture at the same cost as diesel, are you talking about buses or trucks?
I talk about both, actually. So I mean, it's all modular. So I mean, a bus is a truck or a truck is a bus. It's all built up by the same components. So it's.
Because we are told, I work with cities in Gauteng and Cape Town in South Africa, and we are told that the cost of electric buses are between 3 to 10 times the cost of diesel.
Yes.
So, but you say that in fact it's the same cost.
No, not for the electric ones. I tried to say it initially that we could operate anything, biogas, ethanol, biodiesel, that we could operate on the cost of diesel. We have actually gas buses running up in the Free State.
Okay.
That runs cheaper than diesel also, and could be powered with biogas. So those type of solutions. But electric we are working on, but that is not commercial as of yet.
Okay, good,
for heavy duty, I would like to be very clear on that. It's been.
Thanks, because that's I wanted to clarify that because I didn't want to go back with the wrong information.
Absolutely.
But also the narrative among city officials too is that buses, it's easier to run buses on electricity than cars because they have a fixed routine and it's easier to decide when and where to charge them, which is also contrary to what you were saying earlier.
A few bus routes, I've been a bus operator myself, so I mean a few bus routes where you actually don't need the flexibility in the vehicle, where you could actually run the same bus on the same route in the whole operation, but that is quite rare actually. Most bus operators need flexibility in their vehicles, so to put them on different lines and on different routes. And that would obviously sort of advocate for a full battery solution where you only run it on batteries to give it autonomy. But those solutions are still quite expensive, and we really don't have the battery performance we would like to see for that. So, as was mentioned here previously, I mean, we see that an opportunity charge type of electric bus would give the best economy if you want to go for electric buses. As of now, we still really hope for much better battery performance, but most batteries, unfortunately, are made for cars, not for heavy duty at the moment.
Yeah, thank you. Unfortunately, we're out of time. We have to vacate the room. Sorry, I can see hands there, and people really want to ask questions. But please do approach our panelists and ask the questions while we're leaving the room. And I would like very much to thank our panelists, and let's thank them the usual way with a big round of applause. Thank you very much for being here. And